Hi, it's Lisa from Wild Eye Embroidery. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to look at how to do French knots. So as you can see from the screen, I'm going to show you lots of different examples of doing French knots. Along the top, I'm going to show you the number of knots I'll be doing, and down on the left hand side, this is the number of individual strands we're going to use today. So we'll start off with one strand, one knot, and so on, and then we'll go down and see how that looks with 2 strands, 3 strands, right up to the 6 strands. So my very first one then, I'm just using one strand of embroidery floss, and we're only going to twist this once. So we'll come up first of all. Now you're going to take your thread in your left hand, pull it across and wrap the thread up over the needle and down again. And now you're going to put the needle down very close to the first hole that you came up through, but not the same hole. Now pull the thread through, but hold with your left hand. It's very important to hold on with your left hand and keep a bit of tension on that. Now once you get nearly to the end, now you can let it go and pull the knot through. Now don't pull it too tight, but again, not too loose either. I'll show you that again. So come up, move your thread over to your left hand, wrap up and back down. All the time you have to keep holding onto the thread. If you let the thread go loose, your knot will be a mess. It usually gets tangled and twisted and it doesn't look great. So one last time with the one strand and the one twist before we move on. Now this time we're going to do one strand still, but with 2 knots. So we'll turn it twice around the needle. So once, twice, put the needle back down through the fabric and hold on with your left hand. So again, up through the fabric, hold with your left hand, wrap up once, twice and back down. Don't forget to keep the needle near the original hole but not through the same one. And we're going to do that one more time again. So if you see the knot that doesn't look quite right, you can actually give it a little tweak with your finger to make it sit properly. Don't be afraid to do that. And this time we're twisting 3 times. Now remember, I'm deliberately doing these French knots very slowly so that you can see and learn how to do them. Once you get the hang of these, you'll be really quick. One last time. Now this time we're going to use 2 strands of embroidery floss. And just like before, we'll see what one knot looks like, then 2, and then on to the 3. So if you're using extra strands of embroidery, the process is exactly the same. Now you should see a tiny little bit of difference in the size between using the 2 strands for the knots and the 1 strand. now we're going to move on to 2 strands and 2 knots this time, so don't forget to wrap twice and down. We're moving now on to 3 strands of embroidery floss, and if you're not sure how to separate your floss, remember it comes in 6 strands. I do have a separate tutorial, so feel free to check that out on my channel. Now what you'll find is the more strands that you use of floss, the harder it's going to get with your fabric. So wait till the very end of the tutorial and I'm going to show you which needle size I have used for each of these, because you can't use a small needle when you're wrapping too many strands of floss, so check that out at the very end. Now you'll see me during this video using an embroidery stand. I would use this for anything at all I would ever sew. It's been a long time since I have actually sewed holding a hoop. I do find if you hold a hoop too long it does get a bit hard on your hands and you'll find you'll get a stiff hand and cramp up. It's not great, it's not ideal. So if you're going to get serious about your embroidery, it is an investment I would recommend you make. Now when you're doing French knots, it makes an absolute massive difference if you have your left hand or your non-dominant hand free, because as you can see here I'm always using that hand to hold the thread so it doesn't knot. And if you have to hold the hoop at the same time, that is much harder. However, if you're doing this today with me, don't worry, you don't need a stand today if you don't have one. Just remember, instead of sewing on your lap, you need to sit at a table and hold your actual hoop on the table and just let it go when you're doing that, so you do have that spare hand to hold the thread after you wrap. Okay, we're moving on to 4 strands of embroidery floss. Okay, now we're going to use 5 strands of embroidery floss. Hopefully you're beginning to see a pattern here. It goes without saying that the thicker the strand and the more times you wrap it or turn it around the needle, the thicker and the bigger this knot is going to be. So a lot depends on what sort of effect you're wanting for your embroidery piece. For my patterns, I will always tell you how many strands I recommend and how many turns or twists I recommend, but entirely up to yourself. You'll probably notice that towards the left side, where we're just wrapping once, the knot is pretty small. It's quite subtle. It can look lovely on some flowers. What I do notice though is that if you use an odd number of turns or twists, in other words wrap it once or wrap it 3 times, it does seem to give a better knot in the centre. If you only do 2 turns or 2 twists around the needle, I find that the centre of the knot just doesn't look as polished. It looks a little unfinished and doesn't sit just as well. That's the reason why you'll rarely see me doing 2 turns. Mostly I will use 3. If I'm doing very fine flowers or something that needs a very small knot to fill a space, then I may use 1, but again it's not my preferred. Entirely up to yourself. You'll probably notice that if you're turning 3 times, the knot is quite prominent. It's almost like a tiny mini little ball, like a snowball, and it just looks good to me, but it's more 3D, so it will come down to personal preference a lot of the time. At this point you'll see me switching to a different type of needle. Up until now I've been using an embroidery needle, also known as a crewel needle. Now I'm moving on to use a chenille needle, simply because we're using 6 strands and most people, if not all, will find it very difficult to get 6 strands through a fine eye of an embroidery needle. You can probably see there how quickly I was able to thread that first go. It is definitely worthwhile getting some chenille needles for your collection. You'll see now on the right hand side of the hoop I have included the needle sizes that I have used today. When we were only using one strand of embroidery floss, we could get away with using a small needle. Now bizarrely, embroidery needles, the bigger the number, the smaller. So number 9 is actually a very fine needle, and then we've moved right down to a number 1 embroidery needle, which is the biggest. After that, as I mentioned earlier, when we went on to use 6 strands of embroidery floss, I switched to the chenille needle, and that was a number 20, just to make it much easier to thread for us. Now if you like this tutorial, if you could give me a like, that would be great, and don't forget to subscribe so that you get new content. Thanks for watching, bye bye.